All right, today is going to be really, well, I'm not going to say it. But today it's two very basic ideas, the product and quotient rules. Now, there were some things earlier involving exponents that we call the product and quotient rules, but this is going to be a little different. All right? So let's start with the quotient rule. And by the way, both of these are talking about how we can take roots that involve multiplications or divisions. All right, so here's the first one. The quotient rule. And it says that if I'm taking a root, and it can be any root, all right, and I'm just going to use A and B, but it could be anything. That is just the root of the top over the root of the bottom. Okay, we did one like that last time. It was the last problem I did, and I said, really, we're just taking the root of the top and the root of the bottom, and that's the way these work. All right, so if I were to ask you, for example, what is the square root of 4 over 49? Well, that's just the square root of 4 over the square root of 49. And what is the square root of 4? Well, it's 2. And the square root of 49 is 7. All right, and that's all there is to it. Now, notice that once I took the root, I don't have the radical anymore. I have a lot of students who've done that. They would put square root of 2 here, like they weren't sure when to get rid of it. Once you take your root, that's done. This is a symbol, and it's like a plus or a minus or a multiplication or division. It's saying take the square root. Once you've done it, it's done. All right. Now, let's see. Cube roots. What about a cube root of 64 over 27? Well, that's the cube root of 64 over the cube root of 27. Cube root of 64 is 4. Cube root of 27 is 3. Okay. What if we were to give you this one? Now, this one's a little tricky. We got to do something first. 12 over 75. All right. Neither of those is a perfect square. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to reduce, I don't know what that first letter was. All right, in this case, it's going to help me if I reduce the fraction first. So 12 over 75, I can divide both of those by 3 and get 4 over 25 just by reducing the fraction. And then this is going to be the square root of 4 over the square root of 25, which is 2 over 5. All right, and that's the quotient rule. That's really all it means. And this is the way we normally use it. All right. However, there is another way the quotient rule can be used. And I guess you might say, I guess in the other direction. Okay. For instance, what if we had the square root of 63 over the square root of 7? And you might be saying, why in the world would I want to use a quotient rule here? Well, it's because in this problem, it actually helps us out. And honestly, the directions for these problems will say, use the quotient rule. So it'll kind of give us that hint. Look at what's going to happen. If we write this, we have two different roots, but we can also write this as one root. We can say this is the square root of 63 over 7. Well, 63 over 7, remember a fraction just means divide. 63 divided by 7 is 9, and the square root of 9 is 3. All right. The square root of 3 over the square root of 27. Again, it's the square root of 3 over 27. That's the square root of 1 over 9. And then I'm not going to break it up, but we know we take the square root of the top and the square root of the bottom. Okay? Let's do one more. All right, the square root of 46 divided by the square root of 2. I'm writing really big now. Square root of 46 over 2. That's the square root of 23. Now, we can't really go any further with that. We could put it in the calculator, but unless you see in the directions something about a certain number of decimal points or it says approximate, don't worry about the calculator. Just leave it like that. All right, and that's the quotient rule. If you've got the root of a fraction, you can think of it as the root of the top over the root of the bottom. Or if you've got a root over a root and they're the same root, now that's important, you can write it as one big root. Okay, well, I've kind of given away the rest of it now. The product rule. Okay, well, the product rule says if we have the root of A multiplied by the root of B, that's the same thing as as those things multiplied together. The root of A times the same root of B equals the root of A times B. Okay. But that's the only way we can multiply roots. We can't multiply, if we had a square root and a cube root, we couldn't multiply those together. They have to be the same root. So, for instance, the square root of 32 times the square root of 2, that's the square root of, we can multiply under the radical, which is the square root of 64, and the square root of 64 is 8. Okay. As long as it's the same root, we can multiply under the radical. The fourth root of 9 times the fourth root of, I'm going to look, 9 equals the fourth root of 9 times 9. That's the fourth root of 81. And if we were to figure out what the fourth root of 81 is, put it in the calculator maybe, we find out it's 3. And like I said, if you have the cube root of 7 multiplied by, the fifth root of 13, we can't multiply these. At least not easily. It can be done, but it's not something we want to fool with. All right, so that's the product rule, and that's the way we normally use the product rule. Now, we can use the product rule backwards. We can start with a root and break it into multiple roots. So, for instance, we could say that the square root of 72 is the square root of, 72 is 36 times 2. And that's the square root of 36 times the square root of 2. And I can take the square root of 36. So that's 6 times the square root of 2. All right, we can do that. The square root of 80 is the square root of, and I'm going to say 16 times 5. Well, that's the square root of 16 times the square root of 5. Square root of 16 is 4 times the square root of 5. All right, so we can use it backwards. And what's going on here? This is an example of simplifying a radical. And this is where we're going to pick up next time in the next video. We're going to talk about simplifying, and I'm going to show you a couple of different ways you can simplify. And then we're going to do a little multiplication and simplification. We're just going to get some practice with this stuff. So that's where we're headed. But for right now, quotient rule, product rule, They're pretty simple, and I think you can get them really easily.